about that. It's opposite of when you're doing it. Whenever you look at that, it's opposite of. I couldn't fix my hat in the mirror.
Well, we're live. We'll give a few minutes for some folks to jump on while you get all that stuff opened up. Crankbaits, huh?
Yeah, crankbait day. Hard baits.
Hard baits.
Maybe even some soft baits.
Well, today is hard bait day online. We're getting a couple folks jumping in. We're going to talk about hard baits. Who's in there? Noah, nice with the good audio check. Look at that every time I start with how's the audio? He's jumping in. Timmy Taylor jumping in with us. Tracy's wearing a great shirt. I like that. All right. Well, we got some folks jumping in. So, Andy Hughes. Hey, I thought you were going to stop up here, Andy. What's up with that? Well, thanks for jumping in online. All right, good afternoon, guys. We got a quick little virtual Fish Fest surprise. Tracy Robinson, you may know his beautiful face. Got on the water with us this past Sunday and didn't put any fish in the boat. But
you can't say that. You can leave that out.
All right, so
I showed you a fish.
You stopped by to drop off your boat, and so of course we're going to put you to work. So we are going to talk hard bait. So today, if you're shopping online, hard bait is the discount code, and all of our hard bait tackle, crankbaits, jerkbaits, all that kind of stuff, along with apparel, is all 10% off online today. Everything's 10% off in the store here in the loft, right up here. All week, but today we're talking hard baits. So here's what I want to do, because I don't know a whole bunch. You give me a little lesson, and guys, if you got questions, Tracy, well, you know a thing or two, so we are all ears. How are you?
All right. Good. Again, Tracy Robinson. Crankbaits, hard baits, lipless crankbaits, whatever you want to call them. It seems pretty complicated when you walk into these tackle stores. You can walk in up here at the loft and you can see hundreds, thousands of crankbaits, but we'll try to simplify them a little bit today. It's pretty much plastic bait or a balsa crankbait. We'll talk a little bit about lipless in there too, but the two types of materials that these baits, hard baits, are made of, when someone says crankbait or hard bait, they're talking about a plastic bait or a balsa bait. Early in the year, we'll just kind of start out and just run it through the year. In January, fish are just they're a little bit lethargic. They're sitting there kind of in their winter pattern. They know that right around the corner is the spawning time. They're going to be migrating up in those shallows. But the aggressiveness of those fish at that time of year is pretty slim.
Okay. So
what we like to start out with early in the year is something like a Booyah One Knocker, hard plastic bait. You can rattle or no rattle, and I'll talk just a little bit about rattle too in these baits because the balsa is not as much rattle. There's a few balsa baits that have a rattle in them, but you can hear the rattle in this. In January timing, this is the primary bait for me on most of these lakes, but not a lot of wobble to it. It comes through the water. It gives a little bit of vibration, a little bit of a knock to it, and this hard bait is easy to cover water with, and it's really triggers the fish in that time of year. That time of year also, still talking about hard baits, jerk baits are a really big player. These baits, especially once you get dialed into an area that's got fish, these hard baits here also made of plastic, still got a rattle as well, but you can throw these out there and just the name itself is what you do. You jerk them and let them sit. This bait will just sit stationary out there. In whatever position your last jerk is in, imitating kind of a dying shad, and are really, really effective in that pre-spawn time of year. Most of the time, I would say those fish are in that 8 to 10 foot range, and both of these baits, hard baits, plastics, are really effective that time of year. This bait's sinking, this bait's suspending. So depending on where you're getting your bites, these are the two main baits that pre-spawn time of year. Throw it out there, find them. Once you get dialed in, this is probably a little bit more effective.
Okay.
You can still catch both, both that time of year.
So with the lipless chunk and wind, Just let it do its thing.
Jerk bait,
Jerk
a
baits.
nice jerk, reel up your slack. Jerk, reel up your slack.
Okay.
Yep. Then the natural progression then is into the March, April, early May timing. Those fish are really up there in the shallows now. They've either spawning, they're up there on their bed, or they're in the nearest brush pile. And that's a really big tactic that time of year, is kind of digging crankbaits through those shallow waters, imitating brim. They're trying to, eat the eggs that they're laying, or they've just laid their eggs and they're sitting over there in that brush pile. And that's kind of when we get into some of the square bill crankbaits.
Okay.
Hence the square bill on the crankbait. This particular one is made of balsa. The balsa has a big role in the fishing, especially in the shallows. This is a custom bait, P&H custom baits, balsa crankbait, and have them here in the loft. But the biggest advantage to fishing these balsa baits is when those fish are on the bed or just coming off the bed, they're in that brush pile, you can really grind this bait through a treetop and not get hung near as much as you would with a plastic bait. This bait is really buoyant. It's going to float when you throw it out there, and it's going to dive down as soon as you start cranking and you hit that first log. All you've got to do is stop reeling. It's almost going to back up and come over that log, and then you start reeling again. So the big advantage of balsa is not getting hung as much in that brush because of the design of it and the buoyancy of it coming back to the top. And you can really get a lot of work done in the shallows during that post-spawn timing, if you will, with the balsa type crankbaits. Also, at the same time, you got the hard plastic type baits that you can throw, that time of year. You can throw these baits up kind of in that same water, but they don't have near the wobble. They will still float to some degree, but they don't come to the top as quick as the balsa would. You're fishing these down. This balsa is going to come up really quick, and this one's just going to kind of meander back to the surface. It's going to get hung a whole lot more. But if you're fishing your pea gravel and sandy and red clay type banks, these non-balsa baits are probably a little more effective. In addition, the balsa is a really light wood, and you can't throw it very far. So covering water sometimes with balsa is a little bit more difficult than it is with the plastics. You can throw these a lot further. They're a lot heavier and probably a little more effective in longer range casting. Once those fish come off the bed, first thing they're going to do is head out to that deeper water, getting out in those staging areas for where they're going to spend their summer at. And that's when it really gets fun to me. All these crankbaits are a fun time of year to catch them and on crankbaits. But once they get out there, you kind of pull out the bigger baits. These fish now, they've gone through that spawn cycle. They're ready to eat. You've got these big plastic crankbaits. This is a 8XD here, just a typical shad colored 8XD. Throw these a long way. They've got the 10XD, the 8XD, different 5XDs, 6XDs, depending on your depth, but you can throw these a long ways. They're going to hit out there. They're going to be sitting on top. And as soon as you start cranking, because of this big lip on it, they're going to start diving down and going in search of those fish that you're wanting to catch. These are really effective in the post spawn when they get on the kind of their summer patterns. The big lip also allows it to deflect a lot more too. You don't get hung very much on these because the lip will hit a log, hit a rock or something, it'll deflect off. And usually that's when your bites are going to come too. A lot of times you'll notice you're starting to hit stuff, wood, and bouncing off of it. And that's when your bites, I'm not going to say always, but a large majority of the time come is when these hard plastic baits, hit the bottom or bounce off of something. And that's kind of takes you right into the fall, and go back to the fall, you're right back on your lipless again. The baits we talked about first, but maybe you're using more of a shad colored now, and it's just a continuous cycle. But those 5 different style baits right there, you can just about get everything you want to get done with a crankbait from January to December with those simple 5 type of baits.
Okay. Andy Hughes was asking the question I was going to follow that. So let's talk about what line you typically like using with the crankbait.
In the wintertime, depending on the lake you're on and the clarity, I'll use a lot of times a 15-pound fluoro. And the reason I do that, you talk about light lines a lot of time on these clear lakes, but even on these clear lakes, these 3/4 ounce baits that you're throwing, I mean, you can go smaller, but the majority of the time, the bait fish in the area and the lake I'm fishing, I'm throwing the 3/4 ounce. So I need at least a 15-pound line not to break the knot at the bait. Has nothing to do with the fish part of it, but just after hundreds of casts during the day, anything less than about 15 pounds, you need to retie very often. Okay. So I'm not retying a whole lot, but I'm using 15-pound line.
Well, and rod reel.
it depends on the technique. The shorter the rod you're using, the more accurate you can be with your cast. The longer the rod, you can probably throw it a lot further, and you also have a lot more bend for the fish to give in the rod whenever you get, hook up with a fish. So I tend to use a 7.3, 7.6 with some of the shallower stuff with the rattle traps, jerk baits, and whatnot. But whenever I get into the big baits, I'm using a 7.8 to 7.11 rod. A lot of bend to it where the fish can do a lot with the rod and help in the landing.
All right. We'll get through some of these questions, and yet we're gonna pick a winner on this one too. So y'all drop some comments. I thought that was Bobby Lane for a second. All right. Any preferred hooks for a square bill?
For all of these crankbaits, and except for the jerk bait, I use a little bit more of a finesse type hook on these jerk baits. Got 3 sets of hooks there, so your hookup is a little better. You have a lot more opportunity to get a hook in the mouth. But especially with these type hard baits, I will use a triple grip hook. I'll use probably a 2 on these bigger baits, and when I get to these square bills, I'll still use a triple grip hook, but I'll use the probably 4 on these square bills. Reason being, I like the bend. If anybody doesn't know what the triple grip is, the hooks are bent inward a little bit. And these baits, whenever you've got a fish on them, it can move around a lot. So if you've got that inward bend, there's a little bit more security into the fish's mouth as opposed to having just the straight hook. So I will almost always change out my hooks on these baits that don't have the triple grip hooks.
Chuck Allen, quit shaking it. Makes me think a big one's gonna jump over your shoulder and grab it. Nice. All right, Scott Smith, just experiment with retrieval speed.
Yeah, what I like to do, again, all this depends on your body of water and time of year. Early in the year in January, and this is going to be contradictory to what I told you earlier, but earlier in the year in January, I'll fish these rattle baits, lipless crankbaits pretty fast, trying to trigger a strike somewhere. Once I get that, location of, where a school of fish are, and they are a lot of times schooled up in January, I'll vary the retrieve just to get dialed into what it is they like. Sometimes they'll like you to throw that out there, let it sink to the bottom, and just yo-yo it back. You'll hear a lot of yo-yo and talking by some of the pros on these lipless crankbaits out early in the year. They'll throw it out there, yank it up almost like a jig or something, let it fall back down, and that's the retrieve all the way back to the boat. Sometimes I've seen it when they're feeding up high in the water column. You throw it out there, as soon as it hits the water, you're reeling, and as fast as you can reel just to get a bite. So
all right,
play around with that just to find what the fish are letting you know.
So with that discussion, what gear ratio you typically like to throw?
I tend to go a little bit higher than probably some people do on gear ratios. I don't ever go less than a 7.3 on any of these except for the big daddies. When I start throwing these 8XDs, 10XDs, if you've got a 7.3, 7.5, 8.1, they will kill you trying to reel those in. So I'll go with a lower gear ratio, which allows you a lot easier crank. It's no effort at all. You do have a lot more revolutions, but I'll usually use a 5.3, 5.4 on the big, and the rest of them a 7.3.
Okay. All right. Andy Hughes again. Do you use a snap ring at the factory eye?
I use not a snap ring. What I will use is comes on this rattle trap here, this booyah. I'll use just an O-ring. I have had too many failures early in my fishing career with snap rings being bent when you've got that fish on the line that you really, really need to get in. You'll never have trouble with it with those 2 and 3 pounders, but the first time you've got a 5, 6, 7 pounder out there, he hangs up on a corner of a pier or whatever, that snap ring has failed me so many times. So I will use just a regular O-ring from the hooks to put on the nose of it.
And what kind of knot do you typically tie?
I tend to use a Palomar more than I do any other knot.
So you don't get too fancy with it?
No. I mean, there's some different knots for punching and stuff, but Palomar's my go-to knot.
All right. Brian asked, do you have any advice for someone wanting to start fishing deep? Fishing deep. Yes. There we go. It's been a long day. Best type lure, what to look for.
Brian, these I got a package here. These XD lures here by Strike King, They've got different sizes, and you can find a size for any depth that you're needing to fish. So I would tend to go with one of the XDs. You know, if I'm in the 8 to 10 range, I would probably focus on a 5XD, then maybe a 8XD when I get in that 12 to 14. If you're 16 to 18 foot, kind of depends on the depth, you know, which model number, but this is a very versatile crankbait. My biggest suggestion is relying on your electronics. You can go out here and throw the very best, most expensive crankbaits in the world, but if you're not throwing them around where fish are, you're not going to be catching any fish. So relying on those crankbaits and getting out there on those ledges, just find those ledges and humps and scan. And once you find some fish, then, you know, vary it around with the different colors and different sizes until you can trigger a bite there. That's the, you know, best thing that I could say, and that seems basic, but that's what I do as an avid tournament fisherman. I'll spend more time scanning than I would actually casting.
So you talked about the expensive crankbaits, and one question that I have: any tips on when you do get hung up? Because I mean, like these, I mean, it's $22, $23 for some of this stuff. So these are definitely not the cheap stuff to throw.
Yeah.
So you want to get that stuff back when it gets hung up. Any tips there?
I keep two different plug knockers in my boat, and that's kind of what we call any of them as plug knockers. But I keep a hound dog. It's shaped like a hound dog. Got a rope on it. I drop it down there at whatever, 20 or 30 feet of cord on it, and I definitely keep those in there for those deeper baits that I get hung up. I keep a Timmy Horton money pole laying up on my front deck, and I've already got it extended and everything because there's no way to throw these all day without getting hung up. And any given day, I may save my bait 8 or 10 times with those. And those poles, I think they're $50 or so. But in a day's time, if you save that $20 crankbait, 10 times you've saved $200 worth of crankbait. So money pole for the easy ones just to go right to, and then for your deeper ones, I'll use the hound dog.
All right. Anything different preferred rod for a lipless crank versus any of the others?
Yeah, there is. A little tricky on the lipless crankbaits. These lipless crankbaits, especially around here, we've got a lot of grass on these lakes, and I predominantly fish Gunnersville, which has got a lot of milfoil and hydrilla. Ideally, you want to have a good bit of bend for your backbone for the fighting period of the fish. But at the same time, if you've got too much backbone, you can't yank it out of the grass. You can't keep it above the structure you need to keep it in. So I will actually use a 7.6 rod with these lipless type crankbaits, and I'll use something almost like a worm or jig rod that's got a really stiff tip to on it, where as soon as I feel that bait going down and touching that grass, I can give it a good tug and pull it up. If I've got a rod that's traditionally known for crankbaits, it's got a lot of bend to it, I hit that grass and I pull. All the rod's going to do is just bend. You don't really get the bait away from the grass. But you've got to be a little bit, more sensitive once you're fighting the fish for those stiffer rods, and you've got to have your drag set right. But I tend to stay in that 7.6, 7.3 range for all these except for the big crankbait.
Do you ever smile?
Who's that coming from?
Brian Lambert.
Brian Spanky. Competitor up there, I see.
It's been
Is that better, Brian?
It's been a long day, guys. Come on. I know you weren't expecting to sit here and do this, so you're being a good sport. I appreciate it. And I know I'm seeing some comments on the good information, so thanks. Your thoughts on fishing with dynamite?
Fishing has been tough on all these lakes, and we've had a lot of conversation over the past few days, weeks over that. I've spent 8 or 10 days down at Lake Martin. It was really tough. You could get bit on some small fish, but it was tough. I fished some Neely Henry, really tough. Talked to buddies at Logan Martin. All these lakes are really tough right now, and I really feel like this whole abnormal situation we've got with the COVID and all the pressure on these lakes has a big impact on it. But fall fishing in general is tough. So, don't let, it get too hung up on the COVID, but fall fishing is tough until they really get grouped up.
All right. So I guess it's the simple question, Braid Line, would you, if that's what you got, would you stay away from?
I try to stay away from braid on my crankbaits. The reason being there's no stretch in the braid. And these fish, whenever they hit these crankbaits and they're fighting, they're shaking their heads, you will pull the hook more times than not. You'll get a lot of fish in on braid, but if you've had something with fluorocarbon that's got just a little bit of stretch, or even mono that's got a lot of stretch, when those fish come up and shake, you will have some stretch in that line that will allow you to keep that fish on the line as opposed to ripping it out of their mouth that you would with braid on.
All right. Hey, Noah, I see your question along the same lines. Hopefully that answers that. What line size for a quarter rattle trap? Same.
Quarter ounce, you can get away with a little bit lighter. I go with as heavy a line as I can get away with on any lake I go to, on any setup I use. If that lake has got some dirty water in it and I can get away with throwing a quarter ounce on 20-pound line, I'll throw it on 20-pound line. Even though it would, make more sense in a clear lake to use 10 or 12-pound line, I use the biggest line that I can get away with because I don't want it to break.
All right. Nice Bash U hat. So Noah, we actually co-sponsor. We partner up with the City of Gadsden, the Tourism Board, and Fish Dealing Henry, and bring in Bash U. We've done that the last few years, and waiting to see exactly how it's going to pan out. Usually we do it in January, but last year we had about 215 folks come in for the weekend. So there's my plug for Bash U. For sure, if you really want to get in and get some knowledge, I think the whole weekend, the whole time is about $200. But between the freebies and the access you get, I would hands down say that it is worth the money. Great environment, and I've heard a lot of positive feedback. So there's thanks for giving me the chance to make a Bash U commercial. All right. What's your biggest bass you've caught on a crankbait?
I couldn't tell you the exact ounces. I've caught a lot of 7 to 10 pound fish on a crankbait. The only fish I've caught a couple of fish over 10 pounds, and they've all been on swim jigs. So 7 to 10 pound range.
All right. So I think we talked about this on Sunday, but what's your overall personal best?
At Gunnersville 2 years ago, fishing a tournament in March, I weighed in 1198. That was the biggest fish I'd ever caught in a tournament. I maybe had 10 feet of line out. I was throwing a swim jig, and I could see my bait coming back to the boat. It was so close to me, and that fish hit, and it was like I was hooked onto a truck. I set the hook, and there was nothing budged, and I acted like a little 5-year-old. I just started walking backwards in the boat, holding my rod, just trying to get it to the boat. It almost freaked me out. It was so big, but basically 12 pounds.
All right, that's awesome. All right, guys. Well, I think we're 22 minutes in. I think some folks probably need to be going home from work. And I appreciate you stopping by. You got any other knowledge to drop on hard baits?
The last thing I'd like to say is just tie these on and go fishing. I mean, they're simple baits to throw them out there, reel them in, and once you start getting in tune with what the fish are liking, you'll understand a little bit about the techniques, the speed, the different styles of retrieve to make. But you really can't do it wrong. You throw these out there, and some fish are going to eat it at some point. But the more you fish them, the better you get. The more you understand what the fish are liking in your crankbait. So just go out there and just spend a day only just throwing crankbaits. And that's what you have to do basically with any of these baits. I've had baits that I struggled with that I really wasn't good at, and that's the only bait that I'd put in my boat and go fishing with. And that's really the only way to get better with it.
All right, we got a couple that might be some quick ones. Color
discussion. Again. Only thing that I'll say on colors, I really tend to stay with shad colors most of the time, except for on these lakes, this orangish red in January, February. For whatever reason, you can listen to a lot of the crawfish color stories, and that's what they're targeting after. But in January and February, they like the red oranges. And then I'll turn to a brim color when they're on bed, because that's kind of what they're trying to do, is fend off the brim from eating their bed. And then once they get out into that deeper water, you're really shad imitation. So okay. Red, brim, shad.
Okay. And I'll be a sales guy and answer this one. What Skeeter boat do you run? FXR 20, which will be for sale here shortly.
Yep.
So we're going to pull the wrap off of it and get her all ready together. So you've enjoyed that boat this year.
That's been a phenomenal boat. And I work with Honda, and just about every vehicle you make, somebody can find something wrong with it. This is actually the first boat that I've ever owned, brand new, had it for 1 year, and never had one single thing go wrong on it.
All
Everything on this boat works since day one, and that's abnormal. So I'm not trying to give a plug to Skeeter or anybody.
Set that expectation way up here.
There's just so many things that can go wrong, and they do. But that boat has not had one single thing.
Yeah, for guys that haven't bought a new boat ever or very often, you're always going to have that little punch list. There's usually going to be little stuff, just like buying a new house, new RV. Any different tactics when the water level has dropped to the winter levels?
Drop into the winter levels, you just have the fish are going to go with the water, and it doesn't really change your crankbait style or anything. Where once was 3 foot deep, now maybe dry land. You just move on out with the fish and still use the same crankbait, same tactics. But in the fall, going into the winter, I think the square bills and would be a little better early in the fall, winter, and then once you get into the winter, those less moving baits, less vibration, less rattle, less.
Oh, we still got folks hanging out. Oh, awesome. All right, guys. The internet. Noah, you won if you didn't see that. And we're going to get out of here and get ready and go home. So, guys, have a great day. We will catch you tomorrow. Like I said earlier, not sure what we're going to do, but we're going to get on and talk about fishing. So we'll see who shows up tomorrow. Thank you so much. We'll see you guys.